Hey, welcome everybody to our virtual session on Tuesday afternoon here at the SEMC hybrid virtual and in-person conference. It's been very exciting having everything going on at once. I'm Tracy Kinnan. I serve on our programming committee, and I'm curator of education at the New Orleans Museum of Art. I'm here to introduce this afternoon's session. Just to make sure you're in the right space in case you can't see it on your screen. This is Transforming the Narrative in the Virtual Space, Ethical Interpretation of African American History and Culture. And again, we are here at SEMC 2021. I just want to let you know of a few housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. First, I just want to let you know that live closed captioning is enabled, and you can turn that on to your own Zoom screen with your Zoom controls. Just hit the CC button there at the bottom. Just know that is a slightly delayed, and you've probably learned by now, not completely accurate, especially when it comes to names, but do know that is available. Also, this session is being recorded. Links will be made available to everybody in the very near future. We don't have the exact date, but these will be available to rewatch. Evaluation surveys are also available, but apparently we're having a slight difficulty with all of the different digital technology that we're using. And so you will find a link to that in FeedLoop. I don't think it's capturing everybody's responses. So those will be sent out also in the future. But if you have any specific comments, please, you may use the chat in FeedLoop or the chat in Zoom. If you're using Zoom on its own, the best place to put your questions is in the Q&A, and that way all of our panelists will see it and be able to respond. FeedLoop is not immediately available to everybody to see your comments, so for immediate response during the session, the Q&A would be best. And I think that is all I need to remind you of, other than just our regular Zoom courtesies. So I am going to turn it over to Jennifer Zazo-Brown. Everyone, please enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session, Transforming the Narrative in the Virtual Space. I hope that everyone is having a great day and a great week so far. We'd love to know where everyone is tuning in from. So as you come into the room today, share in the chat where you're joining us from. I'm wondering if we have any people here in the room that's joining us on the ground in Chattanooga at SEMC 2021. Definitely missing seeing everybody in person, but let us know where you are, and also something you hope to learn today, that you hope to learn more about today during the session. So my name is Jennifer Zazo-Brown, and I serve as the Museum Program Specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This session today focuses on the Ethical Interpretation Workshop, which is one of the longest running training programs in the museum's Office of Strategic Partnerships. It launched as an early initiative of OSP prior to the museum's opening. And continuing into its 6th year, when we relaunch next year in 2022, this workshop provides technical training for museum professionals on interpretive theory and ethical practice. Over the last year, this program has undergone a year-long evaluation and a complete redesign to transition from a place-based training program into a hybrid model that can now be offered partially remote or 100% virtual as needed. So I'm joined today by my esteemed colleagues, Claire Eckert from the Smithsonian Organization and Audience Research Unit, and Allison Leitner of Smithsonian Enterprises, who have both played a pivotal role in the evaluation and redesign of this program over the last year and a half. So I'd like to welcome them to the session today as well. Our presentation will specifically focus on the methodology that was used to conduct a thorough program evaluation and measure its impacts of this training on the field, as well as the year-long instructional design process that guided the redesign and the pivot of this training into the virtual space. So before we dive in, I just first wanted to share some of the core tenets of the workshop and some of the key strategies that are used by workshop facilitators. When OSP designed the training, we designed it with organizational impact and enhanced professional competency in mind. So developing best practices for ethical interpretation is really core to this training. Specifically, how do we define difficult history for ourselves and for our visitors? Using immersive experiential activities like conducting site visits to local historic sites such as McLeod Plantation and other significant sites throughout Charleston also helps to frame for cohort members what they're learning in the training. In some years, this also included opportunities for participants to meet and engage with members of descendant communities. This workshop is also designed to equip participants with tools that share what they have learned about ethically interpreting history at their home institutions, as well as how to frame conversations with visitors. Appropriate use of language and cultural frameworks that participants can use to better engage visitors in conversation are just a few of the topics that are covered in this course. And then the last component, which actually kind of happened organically, though we're much more intentional about it now, is that the training really fosters a space where our participants can engage with one another to effectively build a community of practice and support among peers and colleagues in the field. And this really kind of grew out of when we were on the ground, the opportunities for our participants to sort of step aside and have side conversations with one another about the work that they're doing or about particular aspects of the workshop when they were doing some small group work or perhaps even practicing with one another as they were preparing for their final presentations. So that growing community of practice is something that we've really been focusing on and trying to make more effective and build more activities to allow that to happen, especially in the virtual space. So just a quick note before we move on, some of the photos that you see here on this screen are members of the 2020 cohort and workshop facilitators during one of the site visits last year on Johns Island in South Carolina. We had an opportunity to visit the Progressive Club. So civil rights leader Esau Jenkins had established the Progressive Club in 1948 as a space to address racial injustices and civil rights issues in his local community. And it was a really special experience because cohort members had the opportunity to actually meet with Jenkins' son, Bill Jenkins, who's prominently featured in the center of both of those pictures there, along with Jackie Jefferson. She's the woman wearing the shawl next to Mr. Jenkins, and that is Esau Jenkins' granddaughter. So they had an opportunity to really talk to family members. They shared stories that took place there historically, and also talked to cohort members about the work that's currently being done to preserve the site for future generations. So this is just an example of the power of place and the kinds of immersive experiences that happen during the training. So this is a broad overview and project timeline for the project that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here because I know that both Claire and Allison will address their work during this process in depth. But I just wanted to provide an understanding of the workshop's evolution. So right now we are sort of located on this timeline. We're sort of right at the end. So in between beta testing and the launch of the application process for our 2022 cohort. But from a bird's eye view, the workshop launched in January of 2016 as a pilot program prior to the museum's opening. And it was originally conceptualized as a training for frontline interpreters to address the high level of stress and burnout that museum practitioners were dealing with, particularly at sites interpreting difficult and violent history for visitors. And after the success of the first year, the pilot was extended for a 5-year period. We then, as we were kind of heading into 2022, which would mark the end of the 5-year pilot program, we started to take a deeper look at the curriculum. We conducted participant evaluations each year after the end of each course. But in 2019, we really started to look closely at the course curriculum, how the content was evolving over time, and the impact that the training was having on the field. And specifically, we were looking to identify areas for potential growth to ensure that this training remained relevant to the needs of museum professionals and cultural heritage professionals. That started with a stakeholder meeting that we had in Charleston in November of 2019, where we invited several cohort members who had gone through the program already, as well as interpretation professionals in the field, to help us think strategically about the way forward beyond year 5. And we implemented some small tweaks to the structure and the curriculum during the January 2020 workshop that immediately followed, but we had slated a lot of those big changes to happen in 2021. So as you all know, when 2020 hit, the project team was still working through implementation of some of these larger programmatic changes when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And due to the ongoing situation, the health risks associated with group gatherings, and the economic impact that the pandemic had across the board, we deemed it necessary to just postpone the interpretation workshop altogether this year, instead use the time to pause and reflect. And since this workshop is so deeply rooted in group learning environment, it really took us some time to think about what do those place-based experiences look like in the virtual space. A pivot to the virtual facilitation was not simple, and quite honestly, it really required efficient time and resources for us to properly prepare. So ultimately, this led to our collaborations with both SOAR and Smithsonian Enterprises for the program evaluation piece of the workshop, as well as the content design process. So I'm going to pause here because I'm going to turn things over now to Claire Eckert, who can speak more about the impact evaluation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with you about the evaluation that we did of the ethical interpretation of African American history and culture. And as Jennifer mentioned, I'm a social science analyst and an evaluator at Smithsonian Organization and Audience Research, SOAR for short. And I'm sure that the auto translation is going to come up with a whole bunch of wacky words for that. I saw one with software, but we'll maybe be able to fix that in the transcript. So as Jennifer mentioned, over the past year, I've worked with her and her team at OSP to do an impact evaluation of the program. And so what this means is that we're really looking specifically at what are the benefits, what are the outcomes, what are the long-term, or I should say short and medium term, and even long-term impact of participating in this workshop on the individual participants, on their organizations, on the visitors who they interact with, that see their exhibitions, attend educational programming, and as well as the field at large. And Jennifer, would you mind going to the next slide? Great, thank you. So I just want to make a little plug, a general plug about why program evaluation is important, why it's critical. It really helps us to understand the outcomes, the influence, the benefits of our programs and our partnerships, like the ethical interpretation workshop, which in turn gives us as museum and cultural professionals and practitioners concrete evidence about our program successes as well as shortcomings. And this information can help us to meaningfully direct our resources and our times into how we do our museum work, our scholarship, our educational work better. As you know, we're always learning. So next slide. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about who the workshop participants are. Most participants worked in institutions located in the American South. However, there were participants from all over the country. In the 5 years of the program, there have been participants from all 27 states, as well as one person from Barbados. Next slide. Participants were emerging and established professionals from museums, historic sites, cultural centers, archives, and libraries. Some were from colleges and university-based museums and galleries, and each had a role to play in interpreting the life, art, history, and culture of African Americans and the diasporic communities. Next slide. To gauge the impact of the workshop, we collected qualitative data through interviews. Along with the help of my colleagues at SOAR, we interviewed 13 of the participants. So that's about 20% of people who participated, 3 senior leaders from the organizations, and 3 of the workshop facilitators and the founder of the program. We selected the participants to speak to who represented a range of organization types and locations, as well as various position titles and levels of seniority within those organizations. The interviews were conducted virtually. The transcripts were analyzed thematically, and the report is currently being written. And the report on the findings will be shared publicly once it is ready. So please note that the findings that I'm sharing in this presentation are all really high level, and there's going to be many more details and nuances and specificity in the final report. And also note that the data collection happened in 2020, 2021 during COVID, and that had a real effect on how some participants were able to implement what they learned in the workshop. And that was especially true for individuals who participated in the 2020 cohort. Next slide. To start, I'd like to explore the impact on the participants. The data tells us that the participants had a profound and overall positive experience at the workshop. Interviewees discussed how the workshop affected them personally and professionally in ways that enhanced their career, their confidence, and commitment to their interpretive work. The impacts include enhanced knowledge and skills, greater credibility in the eyes of supervisors and peers in their home institutions, but also more broadly, confidence to do the work and at a higher standard. There was also gains in inspiration and a sense of rejuvenation, especially important in combating burnout or feeling alone in doing this work, especially when interpreting either difficult or violent history. Professional standards to raise the bar in how they do their work and also how they train others to do the work. Career advancement was another benefit that some interviewees talked about. Many had experienced career growth and taking on more responsibilities and being promoted. And access to a network of knowledge sharing, which Jennifer mentioned in an earlier slide, also called a community of practice. And that really helps people stay motivated, informed, and supported. Interviewees talked about how they developed friendships within their cohort, how they were inspired and mentored by the facilitators, and how they felt validated as professionals doing difficult, important work. It's worth noting that the cohorts were small, fewer than 15 people per year, and this may have contributed to the strong bonds that were formed among participants. Indeed, OSP consciously kept the cohort small to foster greater professional comfort, trust, and honesty as they worked through the content of the workshop. Next slide. OSP designed the training, as Jennifer mentioned, organizational impact in mind. The data tells us that participants easily connected what they learned in the workshop to their professional activities in their home institution. And that's to the benefit of their organizations. In general, participants returned to work ready and able to make larger contributions. And they did so in the following ways. They transferred their knowledge and skills to others in their organization, such as other interpreters and facilitators, curators and educators. And that could be paid staff or volunteers or students that they're working with. They used what they learned in the workshop to create a safe space to talk about their professional challenges and the material that is being presented. They increased their organizational capacity, which includes increased credibility, ability to fundraise more effectively, and the small organizations especially felt encouraged and validated by their involvement with the Smithsonian. They developed new programming as well as reframing and refreshing existing programs and interpretation materials. As well, some participants said that the workshop helped them advance anti-racist work at their organization and position them to stand up against social injustice that's playing out around us. Next slide. Participants suggested that the program had an impact on their visitors, although this is a little bit more difficult to tell for sure in the following ways. Participants felt that there was greater visitor engagement with the content being explored, that there was a sense of increased relevance to the history that they were teaching about and exploring with the lives of visitors and the visitors' own personal experiences. And overall, participants said that they received really positive, affirmative feedback from visitors about their tours and about their visit experience. In general, participants were able to apply the techniques that they learned in the workshop, which made them better equipped to help visitors feel comfortable learning about and discussing content and lessons from the past that they may have either been unaware of or even resistant to. In some cases, these new approaches were said to make their storytelling more inclusive and nuanced, and that has increased the diversity of the visitors in terms of their racial backgrounds, and it's also attracted younger visitors as well as families. Next slide. And in many ways, evidence-based ethical interpretation of African American history and culture in some contexts is an emerging, fast-growing field. So by way of example, only within the last decade have former plantation historical homes in earnest really begun to truly tell the important and nuanced stories of the enslaved people who worked and lived on those premises. And the workshop, in its own way, has contributed to the field-wide conversation in the following ways: providing a corrective for unethical and medicine practice, fostering a community of practice to strengthen this work, and professionalizing the field. Next slide. So in closing, the workshop has had, through this evaluation, we've discovered that it's had a profound impact on participants, on their organizations, on their visitors, and on the field at large. And the training is meeting a need that has not been adequately addressed elsewhere. According to the data that we collected, this workshop gives interpreters and educators tools to increase and contribute to the greater understanding and appreciation of the complex and evolving African American experience. And I'll end with a quote from one of the interpreters who participated in the workshop. This training creates and molds interpreters into not just keepers of historical facts, but people who bridge gaps in our nation's history and gaps between each other. Thank you. So I'll turn it over to Allison to talk about the instructional design process.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. Jennifer, you can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm gonna talk about the process that we went through as we looked at the workshop and tried to reimagine it for a virtual experience. So this slide shows the design process that we used, and that there were 5 main stages, which I'm going to go into in a little more detail over the next couple of minutes. As Jennifer already mentioned, we're currently in the beta test stage, which is the 4th stage there. And we plan to launch the workshop early next year, which again, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer and she'll talk about that too. So next slide, please. So the first stage that we went through was the analysis stage, which is really where the instructional design process always should begin, because we wanted to understand what was working in the workshop that already existed and where there were opportunities to make some tweaks or adjustments, and to make sure that that content was relevant and meaningful, not only to the primary audience of the workshop, but also to the field as a whole. So it was during this analysis phase that, which was during October and November of 2019, where we interviewed workshop alumni using an online survey. And we also held a 3-day gathering in Charleston where we talked about the workshop with alumni, facilitators, and some experts in the field. So then after the survey and the in-person gathering, we looked at the data that we'd collected so that we could really understand where the strengths of the program were and where we had opportunities to address some of the gaps. And then this is the analysis really informed the redesign that we did. Next slide, Jennifer. Thank you. So when we moved into the design phase, what we were doing is we worked with subject matter experts in the field of ethical interpretation. And we spent a lot of time at the beginning talking about who the workshop is really intended for. So often audience is defined by an easily measured set of criteria. So a participant's age or their years of experience in the field. But these markers just really didn't seem to fit cleanly for the audience that this workshop was aimed at. And so during this design phase, we actually identified the target audience by their approach to interpretation. And so we described them as museum professionals committed to advancing the work and principles of ethical interpretation at their institutions and within the field. And then we layered on top of that we also wanted to reach audiences who are racially diverse and who have limited access to professional development opportunities. So once we'd really understood the audience that we were looking for, then we started mapping out the goals and objectives of the workshop. And this is where we asked what participants should be able to do at the end of the workshop. And then we worked backward and we mapped out everything they would need to learn in order to be able to do those things at the end of the workshop. This gave us our teaching goals and objectives, which then in turn informed the design of the course curriculum. So knowing everything we want to teach and the final outcomes of those lessons allowed us to figure out what needed to be taught when for participants to really be able to fully process all of the information that we were going to be giving them over the course of the workshop. So next slide, please. So the next phase after design is the creation. So after we'd mapped out the framework for the course and the curriculum, we're then able to really move into creating the content. So this is where we look at what are the teaching resources that already exist that we can repurpose, and what do we need to create during this process. And here we talked a lot about how we might translate in-person experiences and teaching techniques into an online environment. And it's not easy. It's hard to translate experiences just sort of generally, but especially when people are really unfamiliar with the platform you're using, or if they're new to teaching online in general. So it can be really daunting and unsettling. And that's common because you don't have an image of what the end result is going to be. So you don't know where you're going and haven't really seen this in practice. And it's something I hear a lot from the people that I work with, the subject matter experts that I work with in adapting these experiences. But there are some ways to do it. So for example, one of the things Jennifer brought up that we heard a lot during the analysis phase is that the community of practice that exists among the alumni of this workshop is one of the most critical elements of the experience. So we knew how to build that community in person, but we had to create ways of translating that community building experience into something that works in an online environment. So we can use breakout rooms and small groups online. We can have rules of the road that include having your camera on during sessions and asking participants to pass the microphone to other participants so that everyone's really encouraged to look out for those who might be more reluctant to raise their hands. We also spent a lot of time talking about the site visits and how can we take this other really critical element of the program that's very much in person and translate it into an online experience. Because simply watching a video tour of a site doesn't necessarily give you the same takeaways as being there in person on a personalized tour. So we had to really think about how we might create digital first site visits that allow participants to have similar experiences as the in-person ones in equally engaging ways. And here I should mention one of the things as we went through this design process is we were simultaneously thinking about two experiences. The first is a hybrid where there'll be an in-person online for several days and then an in-person. And the other one is a completely virtual experience, which is the backup plan if we're not able to do the hybrid. And Jennifer's going to go into this in a little more detail as well. So once we had the content developed, we worked on designing the user experience in the online platform. The platform we're using is called edX, which has both a public and a private facing side. The workshop will be hosted on the private facing side so that we can have a small and personalized experience, which again is really critical to that community building. And we've created this experience virtually where there are opportunities to connect with other participants, both synchronously, so live, and asynchronously, so offline. And then all of the resources needed for the course, so the homework readings, the presentation PowerPoints, digital tools used during sessions, Zoom links, everything are housed within the course platform. So participants have a one-stop shop experience. So they don't spend so much time trying to navigate the platform that they can't focus on the content. And then after creating the visual layout, we uploaded all the resources to the platform. So next slide, please. So then this is the stage we're on now, the beta test. So during this phase, we're looking for ways that we can make tweaks that will enhance the user experience and make this a successful course right out the gate when we launch it for participants. To do this, we're working with a number of people who represent that target audience that we talked about. And we're simulating the learning environment by having the beta testers use the edX platform to access materials and sessions. And then at the end of the beta test, we will ask for feedback, and then we'll use that feedback to make any edits necessary. And we'll incorporate all of those edits into the platform, and we will be ready to go when we launch, which is, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer now so she can do the big reveal. Jennifer.
Thank you, Allison. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that now. I guess you're probably wondering, so what does this new version of the workshop actually look like? So some of the recurring feedback and thinking back about the evaluations, both the course evaluations that we did each year following the programs, and also the larger evaluation that we conducted with Claire and the team at SOAR. Some of the recurring feedback that we kept getting from workshop participants was this feeling of disconnect from the Smithsonian. So participants were engaging in a training that was offered by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but it was in Charleston, South Carolina. And while there were a lot of great resources that we were plugging into and that participants had access to while in Charleston, many of the cohort members still had not had a chance to visit our museum in Washington, D.C., or experience our museum's approach to storytelling and the interpretation of history and culture through an African American lens. So the original intent of the redesign was to recenter the curriculum and more holistically integrate our museum throughout the training. And then in full transparency, COVID came along and complicated that plan quite a bit. So on top of the curriculum piece, the team was also tasked with beginning to think about greater use of technology and the role that that will play in this new version as well. So here we have basically the layout of what this new hybrid training model will look like. As opposed to being in person for the classroom days, the virtual training sessions will happen over the course of 5 days, and those will be delivered through the Smithsonian edX or Edge platform that Allison was mentioning. Previously, when the course was first developed, it used an established curriculum. It was the Certified Interpretive Guide curriculum of the National Association of Interpretation that we were using as sort of the basis of our program. And then on top of that, the National Museum and our collaborators, facilitators in the program, were layering on top of that the ethical interpretation pieces. And what began to happen over the course of 5 years is those ethical interpretation pieces really started to evolve and eventually became sort of more heavily weighted towards that. So in redesigning the curriculum, again, we were trying to sort of recenter and refocus. And what that brought to light is that we really needed a new workbook or a new training workbook that specifically focused on that piece of our workshop. So we are also working with a new team to create a new training workbook that will launch with the new course next year. There will be a sort of almost like a 10-day break in between. So the virtual training sessions will happen. It will be 5 days of virtual training sessions on the virtual platform. And then there'll be about 10-day break in between the virtual training sessions and the in-person experience. And this is where participants really have the opportunity to hone in on their capstone projects and have an opportunity to work with peers. So again, in person, this sort of was the time where people got to talk about their individual projects and have that excitement around what their capstone looks like, get some feedback from participants. So we're going to build all of that into the course and allow for these peer-to-peer evaluations or these peer-to-peer building activities, community building activities to happen during the time that we're in break. So they will still be in conversation with one another and kind of working through maybe some of the logistics or challenges that they have in their individual projects. And then some of the biggest changes, or I should say one of the biggest changes that I'm really excited to share is that when we relaunched in 2022, we are actually moving the workshop to Washington, D.C. So for the in-person sessions or the culminating experience of the workshop, after the 10-day break, participants will then gather in Washington, D.C. For a set of curated site-specific experiences. This is an opportunity for participants to be on the ground and to really meet with other professionals in the field who are doing innovative interpretation work and talk about what that looks like at many different sites. And then the entire in-person experience will culminate with the presentation of the cohort capstone presentations. So in thinking about the capstone, now that we had the opportunity to sort of redesign the workshop, we really were, we spent a lot of time talking about what does the capstone project look like? And we really wanted to be intentional about designing a project that participants can create in real time and actually implement at their sites. So not just a hypothetical project, a final project to end the training, but something that they could really take back to their institution. And so basically what this looks like is that the Capstone Project will help to demonstrate the individual's ability to successfully integrate an interpretive theory or ethical practice in a program or a product. And a program or a product could be anything from a redesigned tour or the creation of a tour at their site that addresses an untold story. It could be the reinterpretation of a collection of objects. It could be a staff or volunteer training, an education program, working with youth, whatever best suits that particular that particular cohort member and what the needs of the site are. So we're looking for projects that would help fill a site need or an existing gap in interpretation. And we sort of ask about this during the application process. Really start thinking from before you even arrive to the program, what are some of the challenges that you're currently dealing with at your institution and how can this training help? So the final project, which is a little different from what it used to be before, is now actually a project proposal. So the project proposal will have two distinct deliverables, and it will be a completed project outline that participants will be completing for their specific projects, and then a 10-minute presentation or a pitch of the idea. And so this is what participants will be working on throughout the week, but also that some of that peer-to-peer sharing that happens during the break to really think again about what makes most sense for their site and what does that pitch look like, so that after the workshop is over, when you bring that back to your site, you have something that you can pitch to, to leadership, to your docent team, to a team of teachers that you're working with. And as was mentioned a couple of times today, building the community of practice is really important. It's definitely something that organically grew as a result of this workshop, but that a lot of participants, particularly those who engaged in the evaluation, continually went back to this feeling of having support outside of your institution and across the field for people that you can lean on and continually work with and collaborate with even after the workshop has ended. So in addition to completing the Capstone Project, we really wanted to be again, thoughtful about what that looks like and being able to foster those relationships. So we're going to ask participants to support their fellow cohort members in the development of their capstone and helping, providing opportunities for them to really workshop their ideas together and with peer-to-peer coaching, and then submit some written feedback from their cohort members following the final project presentation. So not only will cohort members be getting feedback from the facilitation team, but they'll also be getting feedback from their colleagues and their peers about what they can do to improve the project, or maybe some other ideas, some other collaborations, connections maybe that they haven't thought about. So community building activities are definitely something that we've been thinking about, particularly in the virtual space, and being able to build those in both virtual session days as well as the in-person experience. So here is the official information about the relaunch of ethical interpretation. The applications for our 2020 cohort will be coming out sometime next month. So definitely keep posted for that. Here are the dates that the session will run. The virtual sessions will begin right at the end of February and run February 28th. Through March 4th. These again are the classroom days, the virtual 5 days of virtual sessions, and then there'll be that 10-day break in between, and then the in-person experience will be March 16th through March 19th in Washington, D.C. I wanted to also take the time to share a little bit about a new program that the Office of Strategic Partnerships has been working on as well, also in connection with Allison Leitner and thinking through a lot of the feedback that has come out of the evaluations. Some of the questions that were asked of participants through the evaluation process were, what are some other ideas? What are some other topics that you would really be interested in having training around? And a lot of things that rose to the top through some of those conversations that we had were environmental justice, working with youth, conducting oral histories, working with community members, building strategic partnerships. So the Urban Environmentalism Program is a new program of the Office of Strategic Partnerships that we will be launching also next year. It's a new professional program that is an intra-Smithsonian collaboration between the Office of Strategic Partnerships at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Anacostia Community Museum. It builds off the legacy of work that Anacostia has done in the environment in working with community members. It is set to launch in spring of 2022, and it will be a 5-day professional development training that also uses our hybrid model. This workshop will be a little bit shorter, so the hybrid days, the virtual days will be 3 days virtually and then 2 days in person. And it is basically professional development training that will serve professionals from museums and cultural organizations committed to developing programs that help to engage community members and partner organizations in conversations about connection of local history, civic issues, health, equity, and the environment. So what this workshop will do is it's going to use the lens of waterways and the Anacostia River and a lot of the work that the Anacostia Community Museum has done in communities connected to that river. And it's going to use that basically as a lens to consider the ways that the environment, that communities working with the environment can impact actions in the present as well as affect plans for the future. So this is the dates for our upcoming urban environmentalism launch. Again, the virtual sessions will happen in the spring. So the dates for that will be May 9th through May 11th. And then the in-person experience also happening in Washington, D.C. will be May 15th through May 17th. You can look for the application process for the urban environmentalism program to open in January 22. And that brings us to the close of our content for today. Let me see if I can get to the Q&A to see if we have any questions. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to drop them in the chat or also in the Q&A box. And Tracy, do let us know if you see anything coming through that we might have missed. I see your comment, Tracy, thank you. She said she really loves this model and, the opportunity to get some time to build community online and then also have time to work on your project. Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about this and what that looks like in practice, what that looked like on the ground, and, what that looks like in the virtual space. Part of, as Allison was talking about, the beta testing, we're getting ready to head into beta testing for this workshop now. And part of the whole intent of the beta test that we're doing, actually that we've done for the urban environmentalism and now that we'll do again with the ethical interpretation workshop, was really for us to test the virtual platform and the interactivity and the engagement on the platform with participants. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Allison, but that was something that we, again, have been really intentional about and wanting to make sure that we're thinking through what that virtual interaction looks like.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things which Jennifer kind of alluded to is when you're in person, you can get a lot of really organic community building. People are sitting next to each other. There's breaks where they stand up. Somebody walks with somebody else to go get a coffee. And so we have to really be very conscious about doing that in an online environment, because when you have a coffee break, everybody just shuts their screen off and you walk away. And so so one of the things we test as we go through the beta test is, are we being conscious enough? Are we making sure that we have people talking to each other enough in a structured way? And we're really facilitating the conversations to make sure that there's enough space for people to share their ideas and feel comfortable, but there isn't a lot of dead air where people don't know what they're supposed to do. So so that's one of the reasons it's really important to test and get a lot of feedback on that.
I'm wondering if anyone has questions for us, and maybe if you don't have any specific questions about the workshop so far, maybe in the chat you can share a little bit about a virtual program that you've attended over the last year and a half, and something that you really enjoyed about it, whether that was a community building activity or a new and interesting platform that training used. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of that in the chat, we'd love to know what that looked like for you.
So I see that Heidi recently attended SCMC's anti-racist training. Thanks for sharing, Heidi. I use Zoom and Google Drive. Yeah, I think it's, one of the challenges too is, and one of the things that we beta test for here is using a platform. So we have this platform called edX where it's a learning management system, kind of like Canvas or Blackboard, if you're familiar with those. I personally find it to be more user-friendly, just in terms of what it looks like. But you have to, learning a new platform is always a struggle too. And making sure that you have the right connections and people can find things in the right way. So what is the map of how you find things, and where do you locate the really important things so that they're easy to access? So those are also things that we test. But Zoom is a great platform. So we're also going to be using Zoom in this, in both of these workshops, actually. So we'll be using Zoom to host things.
And we'll be using Zoom meeting. Again, I think that we talked about this throughout this session today, that for both ethical interpretation, and we're also using the same concept moving forward with urban environmentalism, we purposely keep the cohorts small so that we have the opportunity to engage with participants. So in the Zoom session, they will be meetings, not a webinar style, so that we are meeting literally in a meeting room each day and having an opportunity to see one another's faces, have conversation. There's definitely breakout groups that and activities that will happen throughout the week that will allow us to talk more intimately with some of the cohort members in there. But again, those are all parts of how do we build community online? How do we build that in a virtual space? And being able to see one another, to have meals with one another, to be able to chat with one another, side conversations, working on projects together. All of these are different ways that we can engage with one another in community during the workshop.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Tracy put in the chat that she was in a session where there was people either had the video on or the video off, and video on was sort of this performance aspect, like acting out something, and then the video off was watching it had a good good response. I wonder if some of that is, even though we want to create a space where we're all together, is recognizing everyone needs a break and needs to step away. So it's nice to have permission to turn your video off sometimes, in the same way where, we said, we're really going to ask that people keep their videos on so that we have that, we're able to build the community, but that also comes along with setting some boundaries too, or, it's like, if you have to step away because something happened, or you have to like take a bio break, like turn your video off, go take care of yourself and come back, and that's okay. Right. But we also understand, like, it's okay if you get hungry and need a snack, and, it's going to be longer than a 3-minute snack, then you can eat online, or you can, have something to drink. Like, that's okay too. And so kind of, being really clear about those boundaries, I think really makes a difference. And then I'm looking at Tracy's other comment, or saw a presentation this morning with an app called Pear Deck for spot polls. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, some of those online tools. So we're going to be using Jamboard a lot in this workshop. And then trying to think, we have some Mentimeters that we're going to use. So just some sort of digital tools to kind of change it up a little bit and add some multimedia experiences. There's some videos we have people watch, as well as PDF readings. I see that Jess uses Flipgrid a lot for interactive, and Jamboard. Yeah, Jamboard's a good one. We also, our main discussion board is going to be using Padlet. And so that's also a really fun tool where we can kind of easily navigate around. It's a really nice visual. You can make it really colorful. We get a thumbs up for Padlet there. So Padlet's another great one with the where people can post. And one thing we found, I also helped with the SEMC Leadership Institute, which was one that was supposed to be in person in April of 2020, and we ended up pivoting online in November of 2020. And we used Padlet there. And something interesting about Padlet is, if you're not logged in, it's anonymous. But that really worked, because we had one of the spaces that we had created was a space for like questions. It was a parking lot and things you were still wondering and things you were still processing. And so for a lot of people, they actually liked being anonymous, because they had some kind of personal leadership work that they were doing and struggling with internally. So that's actually a sort of unintended good consequence of using it, which was interesting.
So please continue to drop your comments in the chat. I just wanted to say that our contact information is here on the screen. So feel free to screenshot it, take a photo of that if you would like information about either one of these programs, and be notified when the application process goes live. You can feel free to drop me an email, and I will definitely let you know once the application process goes live. And I'm going to go back actually a slide, so that if you didn't get an opportunity to screenshot this one, you can as well. That has the dates for both virtual sessions, in-person experiences, and when you can expect the applications to launch. So one other thing that I will share, again, before we go, is that that in the past, when the ethical interpretation first launched, there were some membership eligibility. And I just wanted to make it clear that this workshop, both urban environmentalism and ethical interpretation, no longer has membership requirements to be eligible for to apply. So you are able to apply for either the ethical interpretation or urban environmentalism program. The only time that membership, like membership to SEMC or AAAM or any other connecting or affiliated organizations would come into play, is if you were applying for a scholarship that one of those associations is offering. So there will be some scholarships available for ethical interpretation when it relaunches, and that would be the only time that a membership for an association would be required. Otherwise, it's free and open for everyone to apply.
So Heidi had a question in the chat about the target museums for the urban environmentalism program. So Again, this when we talked about the audiences that we were looking for here, we again were looking at the sort of the intention of the professional who was going to be in the group. And so we have defined that audience as professionals from community museums or cultural organizations who are committed to developing programming that engages community members and partner organizations in conversations around the connection of local history, community health, equity, and the environment. And so even though we will be focusing in the course on urban waterways, being near a waterway is not a requirement for the institution or the organization for that the participant is coming from, because what we're really talking about here is access or lack of access to the environment, but not about like the rivers themselves. So Heidi, I hope that answers your question. So again, it's about the intention there of really engaging community and community members.
And just to go a little bit, just to add a little bit more to that, I mean, some of the topics that we're going to be dealing with in that course is looking at defining environmental history and environmental justice, helping participants to identify an environmental concern that exists around in their community that their site is connected to or can be connected to, can help to solve. Reconnecting community to natural resources, both blue and green spaces, youth engagement. So what does youth engagement look like around the environment and activism around the environment? Again, we'll be talking a lot about the Anacostia River and waterways as the case study in which we explore these issues, but the participants are not required to be connected directly to a waterway. It's really any environmental concern that exists for a particular institution. All right. Well, we have a few more minutes, so we are certainly able to hang on the line if anybody else has any other questions that they'd like to pose. But Claire or Allison, do you have any closing comments, thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, just a thank you for attending. And if you have any more questions, please reach out, and we hope to see you in the workshop. Okay.
Yeah, ditto.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today. Thank you, Tracy, for shepherding the session. And again, thank you to all the participants who joined us this afternoon. I hope that you all have a great week, great month, rest of the year. And we definitely look forward to engaging with you next year. If you have any questions about either of these workshops, please feel free to reach out.